Hi, this is Tanush Priyan. I'm a solicitor in Oakland Solicitors St. Albans. Today we are going to discuss about what is an FOB contract. FOB stands for free on board. Is a is the term which is widely used in shipping agreements and plays a crucial role in defining the responsibilities and risk associated with the transportation of the goods. Understanding FOB contract is essential for both the buyers and the sellers engaged in the global commerce. Normally, an FOB contract is a contract which is used in an international business for delivering goods. It defines when the risk and responsibility of the goods transfer from the sellers to the buyer. Under FOB contract, the seller is responsible for delivering goods to the port of shipment and loading them onto the vessel nominated by the buyer. The risk passes to the buyer once the goods are loaded to the ship. Uh, Now, in the case law of Pyrin and Co., it explains about the flexibility of an FOB contract. FOB contract is of three types, which is classic FOB and bare strict FOB and an extended FOB. In classic FOB is an standard agreement for the delivery to the ship, and bare FOB contract is the contract where the buyer assumes more responsibility, including arranging loading. And in an FOB, in extended FOB contract, the seller may handle additional tasks such as securing loading arrangement. Let us see about the advantages of the FOB contract. It has more cost control. Buyers have flexibility in choosing shipping arrangement, potentially reducing the cost. And it has risk clarity. Risk transfer to the ship rail, clearly delineating sellers and buyers responsibility. And it has more transparency, defining obligations, minimizing disputes regarding export clearance and loading. And it has more global applicability, widely recognized and standardized under Intercoms 2020. And disadvantage of a FOB contract is its buyer's responsibility. Buyer bears risk and cost from loading, requiring proactive management, and it has complex logistics. Selecting a vessel and managing insurance can be challenging for an inexperienced buyer, and tight timelines may lead to dispute if the vessels are delayed or unsuitable. And it has some export challenges. Sellers may face complications with export documentation and clearance. And key features of an FOB contract. It has risk transfer. The seller responsibility ends when the goods are placed on board the vessel. For that moment, any loss or damages to the good is the buyer's responsibility. Let us see about seller's obligation. Delivery of goods, section 32 of the Sales of Goods Act 1979 explains about delivery of good. The seller must deliver the good to the named port of shipment and load them onto the vessel chosen by the buyer. And it has some transport arrangement. The seller must ensure the goods are properly handled during transit, and the seller must inform the buyer once the goods are shipped. And they need to provide a proof of delivery. A bill of lading serves a proof of delivery that the good have been loaded must be provided to the buyer. And it has clearance. The seller handles export clearance, including documentation and payment of export duties. uh, the duties uh, the duties embodied in section 29 clause 6 and 61 clause 5 of the Sales of Goods Act uh, is like cost. The seller bears all the cost up to the point where the goods cross the ship rail, after which the buyer assumes responsibility. Section 29 clause 6 of the Sales of Good Act. This section emphasizes the delivery in terms in the contract determines when the seller fulfills their obligation for the FOB contract. The seller duty is complete when the goods are loaded onto the vessel, transferring cost and risk to the buyer. And section 61 clause 5 of the Sales of Good Act defines delivery as the voluntary transfer of possession. In FOB contract, the delivery occurs when the goods uh, cross the ship's rail, marking the point where the responsibility transfers from the seller to the buyer. And delivery of goods on time. They have to they have to notify the buyer, and the seller must notify the buyer when the shipment is done. It enables the buyer to arrange the insurance for the good. It duly closed related to the section 32 clause 3. And the remedies for sellers is they can sue the buyer for the price where the property in the goods have been passed, and they can sue the buyer for the damages for non-acceptance. And let us see about buyer's obligation. The buyer's obligation under FOB contract, they can provide a vessel. The buyer is responsible for selecting and nominating the suitable vessel to the transfer of goods, ensuring it meets the agreed timeline and specification. And they have to pay for the good. The buyer must pay for the goods as specified in the contract to the agreed payment terms. And covering the insurance duties, the buyer arranges pay for the shipping to the destination port, obtains insurance for the good during transit, and cover import duties. And the remedies are under section remedies of the buyers is under section 12, 13 and 14 and 53 of the Sales of Good Act. Section 12 implies terms as to the title. The seller must ensure they have the right to sell the goods. If the goods are not described or subject to the third party claim, the buyer has the right to reject the goods. And section 13 implies the description. The goods must match the description given in the contract. If they don't, they can reject the good. And section 14, it defines about the quality or fitness. The good must be satisfactory quality and fit for the intended purpose. If they are not, the buyer may reject it. And section 53, rights on rejection. If the goods are rejected, the buyer is entitled to a refund or damages. This section outlines the buyer can return the goods and claim remedies for the breach of the contract. Let us see about some landmark cases. In the case of Julia, 1949, explained the FOB contract risk transferred to the buyer when goods cross the ship rail, solidifying this as the standard point of risk transfer. In the case of Arnold Carberg, it happened in 1916. This case point out the seller's obligation to load goods according to the buyer's instruction, reinforcing compliance with the agreed loading agreements in FOB contract. In Bunjay Corporation case, 1981, explained the importance of strict adherence and the timelines in FOB contract, ruling delays in performance can constitute a fundamental breach, justifying termination. In section 17 to 20 and 32 explains the transfer and delivery of carriage. Section 17 of Sales of Good Act, the property passes the ownership of the goods transfer from the seller to the buyer when the both party intended for it to pass. And section 18, rules for ascertaining intentions. This section provides rules to determine when the ownership transfer, often depending on the terms for the contract. For FOB contract, the goods are usually deemed the buyer properties once they are loaded onto the ship. And 19 clause 2 explains about the reservation of right of disposal. The seller may retain ownership of the goods even after the shipment by reserving right of disposal through the bill of lading or other documents, usually to ensure the payment with the contract terms. United Nations Convention on Contract for the International Sales of Goods, Article 67 and 31 to 34 explains risk transfer and delivery obligations. Article 67 describes about risk transfer to the buyer when the goods are handed over to the first carrier for transit, unless or otherwise agreed. If the seller retains control over the goods, the risk remains within the seller. And Article 31 to 34 explain about delivery obligations. And Intercom 2020, the FOB contract terms may transfer to the risk to the buyer once they are loaded onto the vessel. Variation may adjusting shipping responsibilities and clear agreement prevent disputes. Some of the best practices which can be done for a FOB contract to ensure smooth transaction using FOB terms, there are several best practices to follow. Clearly specify the exact port of shipment in your contract, agree on who will bear the loading cost on the vessel, and ensure proper insurance coverage from the point of risk transfer. In conclusion, FOB contracts are the vital tools in international trade that clarify risk transfer and responsibility between the buyers and sellers. By understanding these terms, both parties can engage in smoother transaction, and while minimizing potential disputes, a well-defined FOB agreement not only facilitates an global commerce but also fosters trust between the trading partners. Thank you.